Great, Bridget, we can start.
All right. Welcome everybody who's coming in now. Um, it's good to have everyone here. So we're going to jump right in and welcome to the adventure of learning how to harness the unique intelligence of your inner selves. Um, it's wonderful to be here to share this. And maybe we'll go to the next slide so you just get a quick overview of what today is going to include, which is we're going to give a little review of voice dialogue and also the final eighth process and the secret of the very powerful motivation that all of our inner selves carry. And regardless of whether it's an inner critic or an anxious self, they serve a noble purpose, which we will dig into. And then I'm going to make sure that everyone here leaves with a wonderful exercise called the tug of war exercise. And it's a terrific way to unknot what is going on when you are making a difficult decision. So I'm Bridgit Dengel Gaspard, and maybe we can go to the next slide, Kashana. And I'm based in New York City, and I'm a former performer. And that's when I found voice dialogue, which is this revolutionary technique developed by the doctors Hal and Sidra Stone, who became my mentors. And the idea is that our healthy personality consists of many different selves, different parts that are called alter egos, personas, subpersonalities, inner selves. They all have wisdom, and that includes having a gift and a sting. And so it was finding out about the different parts of ourselves, and that voice dialogue could help us access them, that I got inspired to go get my master's from Columbia University, because I really saw how healing it was to understand that you're so much more than you think you are, as well as how profoundly it magnifies your creativity. So, jumping right in, let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Kashana. So, what is voice dialogue? Voice dialogue is a technique that has you go from one part of yourself and have that part talk from its point of view. So, you get to find out things like what does that part do for you? What is its function? What is its priorities? And when you facilitate this part, you really want to be curious about what's going on. And then you come back to center, and then you go to a different part and you find out what that part wants. And often we have competing agendas. That is the truth. We are made up of many selves, and many of those selves have competing agendas. And so instead of being tied up in a knot between the competing agendas, the self that carries the agenda you can really listen to. And then when you come back and center, you've got the wisdom from both sides. And one of my favorite examples of how voice dialogue works, just in a natural way of how we humans behave, is when the alarm clock rings at 5:30 in the morning and wakes us up from a deep sleep. Suddenly this noise wakes us up, and then we have so many parts of ourselves that respond when this noise jars us from this deep sleep. So a few selves that I have that would respond would be the angry self that wants to throw the alarm clock over across the room, like, be quiet, I want to go back to sleep. Another part of me would be the responsible self. No, I should get up, I've got things to do, and would maybe slowly take over and get myself out of bed. Another self might be a quiet self who's just maybe a little sad and just would like to stay in bed and maybe read all day and just kind of relax and be a little quiet. And another self might be a playful self that says, I want to get up, but only if we call in sick and play hooky and go to the beach. So all of these selves are perfectly legitimate with perfectly good agendas for the day. The only problem is you can't do them all. And so one of the reasons voice dialogue is so effective is we take this natural way of how we operate. And brain research is showing more and more that how we think of ourselves is actually a multitude of selves, and that this is healthy. So that when they do some brain imaging, they see that different selves are lighting up in different parts of the brain. For example, the CEO self is often centered more in the cerebral cortex, which is where we do our thinking and our decision making and have discipline. And some of our more emotional selves are light up more toward the amygdala or deep in the reptilian brain. And the idea is voice dialogue connects you with all of these different intelligences, because depending on the situation, different parts should come to the forefront at different times. So, how do these selves develop? And maybe we could just turn off the PowerPoint slide for just a minute, Kashana. And so I want to just say that the selves develop by again, the natural way that we humans are in this world. We come into this world as babies. And so when an infant comes into their family system and are welcomed home, they're welcomed home by parents who prefer different parts to other parts. So as a natural way of growing up, different parts are given room and given positive reinforcement, and they become what we call our primary selves. And so those parts, it could be our responsible selves, our good boy or good girl, maybe our curious selves or our physical selves. And then for each self that is validated and reinforced, an equal and opposite energy is pushed aside. So those selves are become hidden selves. And they, depending on the household, they might be shy selves or quiet selves or maybe angry selves. So that as we get older, those selves that we are more familiar with, that we lead with, they are wonderful selves. But the problem is they're not the complete picture of you. And so some selves that are hidden, you really don't know that they're a part of you. And some selves that are hidden, you're kind of aware, but you don't like that they're a part of you. And often you would hide them to the world. And that could be a self that might like substances too much, or it could be a self that likes to brag, those kind of things. So those selves end up being pushed aside, and then they come out upon occasion. And again, voice dialogue gives you a safe method to get to know these selves, because here is the primal truth behind them all. Voice dialogue argues that all of our selves have the noble purpose of protection. They all happened when we were infants and we were vulnerable and we just needed to be loved and not abandoned. So regardless of what a self is doing today, contemporarily in your world, they have the noble purpose of protection. And that's the inclusive nature which voice dialogue approaches any self that we have. So let's jump to the final eighth, which is what we're going to focus on today. So the final eighth is the phenomenon of failing in sight of the finish line. It's when hardworking, dedicated people get 7/8 of the way there and are mysteriously stalled in front of their finish line, and they can't accomplish their cherished goal, whether it's in finances, relationship, career, transformation, creativity, health. And examples abound of that last little undone bit that can plague people for years, like the final 5 pounds that don't get lost, feeling ready for your life partner, dating productively, and continuing to cut things off when things become difficult. Or that final incomplete assignment that you don't get to and you jeopardize ever graduating with your degree. Having that amazing business idea, but never quite finishing the business plan to give to the investors that are waiting for it. rocking your singing lessons, getting invited to the choir, and you don't go, and you feel terrible. That's the final eighth. And in my practice, I started to see that this was a situation that happened across the board. And it did not matter whether my client was a lawyer or in the entertainment field. And I began to realize that the 7/8 of all the parts of those people got them that far. The responsible ones, maybe even the visionary ones, the dedicated ones, the can-do selves. And so a lot of progress is made, but then suddenly the goal is almost there and there's a lock. And that's when the final eighth is suddenly blocked. And this phenomenon is not for people who never get started. This is really for people who do the work, who are motivated, but they don't know a really important thing, which is that you think you want your goal with every fiber of your being. But what you find out is that not all of you wants what you think you want, and for excellent reasons. And so when you realize that and you dialogue with the different parts of yourself that are for the goal, as well as the parts that are against the goal, and you learn their concerns, and you deal with those concerns directly, often that block just melts. Because remember that the primary purpose of all of these selves is protection. So for some of these selves, the idea of crossing the finish line is fear-based. There is actually fear about having success. And a lot of people don't understand that being stuck is often a success issue. And the final eighth generally is a success issue because people have gotten so far. But the other thing is that all of those selves that are working so hard to get 7/8 of the way there, they have permission for that. But internally, there's some type of lack of permission to go forward, to cross that finish line. And it's not logical. And people usually double down. Well, I'll just work harder. Well, working harder is never the problem and never the solution because you already are working harder. You cannot work harder. But what has to happen is getting in touch with the vulnerability that's underneath this block. And the way I look at vulnerability, and I talk about this in the final eighth in my book, The Final Eighth, Enlist Your Inner Selves to Accomplish Your Goals, is that vulnerability means to be open. That is the Latin root of the word vulnerable. And so in mainstream thinking, we're always assuming vulnerability is to be open to attack. And I argue that to be open, to be vulnerable, to actually understand what's going on, that is the new superpower. And the final eighth process and voice dialogue helps you really be able to engage with your vulnerability and paradoxically become more empowered. And so we can head to the next slide, if you would, Kashana, because I really want to jump in here. So this is my tug of war exercise. And just so you know, everyone, we're going to be giving you a workbook. It'll be emailed to you in a couple of days from a small world so that I'm going to pack you with information, including this tug of war exercise. But I want you to really look at this exercise. And for everyone who is here, think of a goal that you're struggling with. And it could be anything from, do I take that share at the beach this summer, to do I stay in my current position or do I look for a different position? And the idea is that you think of the parts of you that are for the goal versus the parts of you that are against the goal. So in this exercise, what you would do is list in three selves, because if there's more, you can put them in, but usually there's 3 primary selves. And I'm going to talk through a potential example that a client of mine did. And I want you to do this along for yourself as well. So the idea is that every self has a function. And so let's say that my goal that I'm struggling with is, do I stay in my current position or do I leave and uh, become an entrepreneur? So that's a very important question. And of course, different parts of yourself have been empowered when you work for a company, and they're going to be needed when you have your own company, but you've got to also be able to, as an entrepreneur, lead with other parts that were not necessarily what you led with when you were working for a company. So a lot of the times when we do this exploration, we're actually discovering what parts we need to empower. And that's part of the adventure, because maybe you actually need to learn more about your inner optimist, your inner sage, your playful child. Now, sometimes if you're doing a tug of war exercise over something very serious and very professionally important, as do I stay in the position I'm in working with the company, or do I dare to venture out as an entrepreneur? But again, sometimes the parts of you that hold the key are not the parts you expect. So if an inner playful child suddenly says, well, I'm for the goal, I want to go out as an entrepreneur, put that down, even if it doesn't make sense, because what logically and rationally, because one of the gifts of the voice dialogue and the final eighth process is it takes the blinders off, that it's not just the parts of yourselves that are intellectual, because they are, and they're smart and we love them. But often that's why you're stuck, because that's not where you're going to get your answer. So, for example, do I stay in my current position? One self could be the one that wants security. So the security self, yes, let's stay. And so you ask yourself, so that's one self. And that self, you can ask yourself, what's the function of that self? And that self would probably say, so to keep everything safe. So you know what your paycheck is going to be every week, that you have stability, you have predictability, and that feels good. So from the security self point of view, you get that. Then those are the gifts of the security self. But a sting could be that the security self within you prevents you from taking chances, prevents you from not growing, prevents you maybe from being spontaneous and saying yes. So with each self, you would get the function, and then also the gifts, and then the sting. And then as you get to see them, instead of it all being tangled up in your head because you can't figure it out, the tug of war exercise, you're putting it on paper. You're literally taking out of your head and having it so you can see what's going on in there. And you're also understanding that even though it might be painful, it's painful to be stuck, that some of these selves have very important messages. And so if you're able to, again, tolerate the vulnerability, then you're going to learn a lot. And in that, you're going to have liberation from both the quagmire of being stuck, but also in general. So another common self, whether to stay or go, it says the security self, and maybe the inner critic who doubts that you can be an entrepreneur. So the inner critic just squashes you and says, no, you don't have the ability. But remember, even the inner critic has the noble purpose of protection. The inner critic's theory is that it should insult you first before the outer world insults you, with the hopes that you actually work hard to prove the inner critic wrong. So the inner critic both believes in you because it makes you work harder. At the same time, it berates you often and tells you how you're not measuring up. And I go into how that puts us in a double bind just in that way, making you feel like you can, at the same time, making you feel like you can't. But the inner critic is just trying to look around and keep you safe. That's its point of view. And so as you learn that, you can also make sure the inner critic, as you get to know this, does not berate you or verbally abuse you, as some very toxic inner critics can. So the idea is that we honor the noble purpose of the selves, but we don't let dysfunctional selves keep its dysfunctional behavior up. And that's part of the liberation. And then maybe a third self for the keep the current position. It's a self that just likes it at the company. It's a self like, I like who I work with. I like what I do. Can't we leave just well enough alone? You might call that the status quo self. And so that self might have the value of loyalty. You you feel like this company has helped you grow to where you are. So maybe from that self that likes it, that likes the status quo, um, the gift could be it's loyal, it's a team player, but its sting might be that it may look outward for approval as opposed to looking inward for approval. So that status quo self might say, well, I'm doing well enough. And the sting may be again that it'll be a fear based, like, I don't want to worry about not pleasing somebody. So right now I know the system and that kind of thing. So those are 3 pro selves in the tug of war exercise for staying at a company. What could potential 3 selves be for leaving, for going out and being an entrepreneur? Well, one self could be the visionary. And the visionary, when you just talk with the visionary and really write down that part of you, the visionary might be very excited. And the function will be, there's so much more out there that you're not seeing, but the visionary part of you can see it. And so one of the ways you do this is you just journal as each self. And some of these exercises you'll be reminded when you get the workbook, but that is a wonderful exercise. So the visionary could say, here's what I see, and here's some great ways to do it. And those are the gifts. Now, the sting of the visionary could be that it takes on more than actually you're able to do. And the visionary is not the operator. It's not the one that puts these great ideas into operation. So the sting could be that the visionary dismisses what is going to actually be needed to take place. And so another one that's for the goal could be even a dissatisfied self, like a self who's says, look, the status quo isn't good enough. We do maybe so much more work than our permanent, our current title allows, that a dissatisfied self often is a terrific self because it lets you know when you've outgrown a position. So this dissatisfied self might say, no, you've outgrown this position. You're just hanging on because of comfort. And I'm bored. I want to move. I want the excitement. And let's try some things. What's the worst that can happen? We fail. At least we will know we tried. So that dissatisfied self may actually be a really good motivator, even though it may not feel comfortable. And a sting could be, again, that it starts to get too negative and makes you somehow deflating, it deflates you in some way. And so a third one that could be for becoming an entrepreneur could be someone who enjoys the challenge of problem solving, like a problem solver within you who's like, okay, so if we do what the visionary has in mind, and has just all these ideas, we could start. I know my friend has a basement. We could rent from there, and just that part of you that just puts together pieces of the puzzle and says, okay, well, if this is the goal, what can we do? And again, that's got wonderful energy. And the idea is, when people often talk about self-sabotage and fear, they treat it like a big, broad sweep, right? Fear, self-sabotage. But that's not helpful, because you could argue different selves have more fear, and you'd be correct. But fear-based or sabotage is too simplistic. You could know that intellectually, but now what? And what voice dialogue in the final 8th process does is take each part And then again, as you get to know the gifts and the stings, then you can make much more nuanced and educated in terms of literally educated from how you feel internally. And sometimes a self will tell you, well, if you want to do that, you need to go back to school. Now, that may be exactly right. For myself, I was a performer and I wanted to get into more of the healing aspects of the creativity work and become a psychotherapist and also a coach. And so I did have to go back to school. So that part of me that said, well, if I want to do this, then my next steps need to be applying for school. So sometimes that's the next step is the preparation for the bigger goal. So if someone wants to be an entrepreneur, but they realize I just don't have enough business experience, I need to go get some education, that's fine. Now, a procrastinator may actually use that as a ruse, and you in fact have enough training. And so then you'd go talk to your procrastinator part and you'd really listen to their point of view because they all have wisdom. And often these selves relax and the knot unfolds when you again deal with the concerns underneath. I had a client who I worked with for a long time. And that's why I knew the final eighth when I saw it, because I know my clients worked hard. I was there. I knew they wanted these goals and had everything lined up and were moving up amazingly and then suddenly halted. And so this one particular client I'd worked with for a year, and she was an actress and she was moving up into bigger parts and union work, which in New York City, that's a very big deal. And working with pretty famous actors, she had smaller roles. And then she got a really important audition and she blew it. She blew it. So her inner victim couldn't blame anybody else. And then I said, okay, well, let's see what's happening. We went to the part of her that wanted the part and was very upset and sad to not have gotten it. Then we went to another part, her resistance. That's the other thing. Visit your resistant self. Invite them to tea. Ask, and you can journal. Ask your resistant self. So what's your function? What do you care about? Where are you in the body? So we went to this resistant self, and I expected, I don't know, like a strong kind of no type of self. Instead, this self kind of came in like this and whispered, if my client gets any further up the professional ladder, she will become someone who has trouble with drinking and possibly an alcoholic. I was stunned. Even my client was stunned. And I'd worked with her for a year and this had never, ever come up. So when we went back to center, I said, so what about this information? And she was weeping and she said, you know what? It's true. My client had a lot of anxiety and anxious selves. And the thing about performing and entertainment is that networking and socializing, it's required. You don't move up if you don't go to social gatherings. You don't have to drink, but you've got to be there. And so what this self was doing was, from its point of view, protecting her from having a drinking problem. So from that self's point of view, that self didn't care about the acting. That self cared about my client's overall health. And so now that we had the secret was out, we completely changed our focus. And the selves that we developed were assertive selves, selves that could make a boundary, selves that could handle social interactions, and also problem solving, like you can stay for an hour, and how to nurse a drink for 4 hours, and how to leave early, and how to get enough sleep, how to say no. A lot of people have trouble saying no. And so they have selves that jump in and say yes, and they take on too much, and then they're afraid to back off. And so you really get to see what dynamic is going on with you through these inner selves and their lenses. And I invite everyone here. I have a fun exercise which helps you start to notice right away when different selves are operating. And it's paying attention to energy. So like I said, when that alarm clock rings, we naturally have a bunch of selves that respond. We're not thinking about it. It does. The part that wants to go back to sleep, the part that wants to get up. And they're all expressed in the body. All these selves are physiologically, energetically expressed. So a wonderful, fun exercise, which you can do all day long, which really strengthens your observation abilities, is notice what cells people are in. So even as I'm describing this to you, like a laid back self, they often speak differently. They might have a slower range of motion in terms of physical, but also even how they talk. A lot of people's coloring changes. So when they have an excited self, they may be rosy there and lots of color in their face. Or a self that's kind of nervous and scared is constricted. Maybe they're lacking color because they're kind of just scared and pale. And so start to notice this, because you can really see when people are in different selves just with your eyes, just visually. And certainly you can hear it when you're by the way people talk. You don't have to guess when someone is angry. You can see it. They're charging ahead. They've got energy. You may have to guess what they're angry about. So again, we do this all the time and automatically. But with the voice dialogue and this tool of really isolating and wanting to get to know the different selves helps you know yourself, but also other people. If for example, you know that you have an important meeting with your boss who intimidates you the next day, with voice dialogue, you would talk to that intimidated part, and you would let that part voice its fears, and then you would let that part stay home when you go to work. And by that, I mean, you can keep it close to you. You can feel the feelings, but you activate the parts of you that need to be adult, maybe even alpha. If you're negotiating for a raise, you need to bring those adult parts to the negotiating table. And a lot of times people find out they're bringing their 3-year-old inner child to work and wondering why people aren't taking them seriously, and then being upset and angry because they think they're not listened to. But in fact, maybe they're not even listening to themselves because they're running their show with their children, their inner children. So again, the goal is to have access to all of your different parts, because you need your hard charging CEO by day. But if you go home to your family and children and you're still in that hard charging energy, you can't be intimate. And families in the evening want the parts of you that are warm and loving and cuddling the kid good night. So voice dialogue is non-judgmental. It's not that any part is good inherently or any part is bad inherently. It's that you want to have access to what feels good. And the idea is what feels good for the situation. So the idea is that you literally become the composer to a band and have access to an orchestra that is much larger than you think it is. And that's exciting. So if you think you just have piano and violin, just a few sets of cells, and you find out you've got percussion and wind instruments and tuvan throat singing, it's exciting. And it really is a feedback loop which feeds your creativity and the way that you think of yourself. Um, it's amplifies all of that. So another exercise I want to highlight for people, and I hope you're taking notes because we have a question and answer time coming up in about 5 or 10 minutes. So the other one is the inner selfie report. And this is what I recommend to everyone. You start to write down just bullet points, because I know we're all busy, the different selves in you that you notice. So when you wake up, you start to write down, oh, sleepyhead and gym rat, uh, responsible one, whoever it is that you immediately feel. And you just keep a list all day long. And I suggest you keep a list for when you're working, like a work day, and a non-work day, because that's the other thing. Different selves operate in different arenas. And again, all of this is perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. But you might be really surprised what selves show up. And the other thing is, even if you don't express a self, like say I feel my anger, but I don't say anything, that would be actually two selves. That would be the angry self because I felt the impulse. So even though I didn't express it, I would put it on my inner selfie report. And then the self that said no, like don't say that angry thing. That's also a self. So just start to write those down and start to ask yourself just what are the functions of each self? Again, in a curious, non-judgmental way. And if a self is resistance, ask, so resistance, wow, what do you care about? Where's your agenda? Where are you in the body? Because as you go through your day and you have more awareness, you can suddenly feel your nervousness maybe in your throat. Maybe your nervous self lives sort of in your throat, but maybe you weren't aware of that before. And so just even the awareness is so empowering. Or you see a self sort of coming up in someone that you're working with or in family member, and you can make more conscious decisions about what parts of you you're going to bring up to the self that you see is coming up. So I know we're moving into questions. I'm just going to see if, please do start dropping your questions in the comments box. And I look forward to answering them. And again, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, and we're going to have a workbook come your way so you can dig in. And of course, I'm available. You can reach me. And let's see, let me look at the chat to see what's coming up. So Nermeen, welcome, is recommending, do I recommend any meditations? Yes, that is a great question. So a meditation that's really great, and I'm going to show you. So with the way voice dialogue works, you start in the center. So a wonderful meditation would be is to just move over, which I hope you can see here. So when you move over, you're actually shifting your perspective already. You're not here. And so when you meditate, let's say you want to, let's say you're anxious about something and you really want to hook into your inner wisdom. So then you move over. So and you can close your eyes, whatever you're comfortable with, and breathe, of course. And if you only have a few minutes, set the alarm so you don't have that self in you that's always looking at the clock. And then you meditate from your inner wisdom, and you feel where your inner wisdom is. If you feel like you're not connected to that inner wisdom, ask yourself, when was the last time I just had this really great insight, or this idea came to me from deep within? And that's a way you can induct this wise self, for example. But you can do that with any self. Just meditate in the energy of that self and just get to know it. And then if you have a specific question, and then you come back and just let it feed you and see what it leads you with. And again, it highlights that we are not one self. And someone else is asking, Fabian, thank you for your question. Do you recommend getting a business coach when you start freelancing or joining a business coaching group? I am a firm believer in both. I love groups. I think groups are, they get that group mind. And especially when there's a safe group that you grow together, people will give you ideas you simply wouldn't have thought of. And that is so valuable. Also, you're able to do the same with other people. And there's something about a group that makes you more accountable. So if you've got parts that like to hide and kind of not get to things, a group can certainly keep you on target in a way that you want to. Personally, I think getting an individual coach as well is helpful because sometimes there's very particular things you need to explore, and they're deeper than what a group often can do together, because this is often where the emotions and the goals come together, which my final eighth process absolutely talks about. So and that's my recommendation. And the great thing about the internet now is if you have a particular business, just to even start initial researching is so easy because you just go on the internet and see what's there, and also which groups are good. Also, Kashana has put my wonderful colleague in the chat box for everybody. I did an integrating opposite energies meditation, and she put in the link. It's a powerful meditation, and I recommend it for everyone. Please contact me also if anyone. I'd love to hear feedback when you try some of these things. Let's see. I'm going to look to see if there's other questions.
Also, Bridgit, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the safety of the modality? So oftentimes people have this belief system, mainly here in the United States, I don't know about abroad, that everything we do has to be sit down, head talk therapy, right? And so there's a quality to this work, and it's not about that type of a therapy loop. This is about a safe way to delve in. So can you just speak, I'll go back to the slide, but can you speak about the safety?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, so the safety is that we that it's based on our natural inclinations. That's why I love the example about the alarm clock so much. So, but often, as like you said, Kashana, in the US anyway, there's such an emphasis that our smartness should lead. And that often makes people feel even worse because they are smart and it's not solving the problem. So the safety is the allowance that, of course, we have different intelligences. And you can even know that intellectually. But the voice dialogue method, where you really get to isolate a self and just say, okay, perfectionist. And I recommend absolutely journaling, say, from the perfectionist point of view or from the goal setter's point of view. And so the safety is understanding that there's validity to everything. The problem is when we lean too much on one side or another. But we always come back to center. And so it's like you have more access to more of you. And that's what makes it safe. And I see that. And so as Kashana is highlighting here, the classic method, which, by the way, everyone is welcome on the third Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern US time. We have a free voice dialogue learning lab. And we show a genuine voice dialogue session, which is just what Kashana is pointing out, where a facilitator and a subject get facilitated, and you can see this amazing work unfold, and you can actually learn stuff for yourself, given the selves that get facilitated. And I know there was another question I saw from Alicia, who says, is it possible that one of my selves likes someone and the other selves not? I love this question. Possible, it's probable. That's a perfect example. So the selves, so yes, so if you're thinking about a person, you can put that person down, and if you could even use it as part of the tug of war. So Kashana, if you went back to the tug of war slide, that would be terrific, because we could even do it with that. So let's say the tug of war. I like I don't know, we'll call it Henry. I like Henry could be the blue side, and I don't like Henry would be the orange side. So on the blue side, it could be I like Henry, maybe my fun lover likes Henry, my uh my faithful friend self likes Henry, that kind of thing. And you literally write it down. And then you can ask yourself, like, what it is exactly that's appealing. And then on the other side, the parts that don't like Henry, it could be, the part that says you ignore that Henry is dishonest. So that could be the part that really is doesn't trust Henry, untrusting self. Maybe an ethical self that feels Henry isn't as ethical as you. And so again, it's not about making who's right or who's wrong about whether to like him or dislike him at the beginning of the tug of war exercise. But as you write this down, the process itself helps you feel where you really are. And then once it's all out again in front of you, then you can really make a more conscious decision. And let's say, I'm making it up, but let's say Henry is a potential love interest. And the parts that don't like Henry have really important parts and answers about why you shouldn't really be pursuing Henry. It's not good for the long term. And so, even though it's difficult, really feeling that truth could help you with your higher goal. For example, if it was like wanting a life partner, and the cells that don't like Henry really make some undeniable points about how this person could be a fun affair, but not a life partner. So this is a perfect example, and why I love this exercise, because it's not saying yes or no to Henry, but it's saying, well, how do you feel? And let's see, Alicia's asking, how do I make sure all my cells like my husband? That's fabulous. You know what I would say? You can have some cells that don't like your husband. Let them tell the truth about how they feel. That doesn't mean you tell your husband, but it's like journaling. And you ask, well, what is it that you don't like and why? And you just listen. It doesn't mean you have to act on their opinion. And sometimes the cells that don't like Henry, they actually maybe want something for you. Like maybe they're not so much against Henry, you find out. I'm using that name synonymously, but maybe those cells feel like you've given too much of your free time to what Henry likes and not what you like. So when you dig in, you also realize some of the reasons you assumed are actually not why a self is particularly resistant, because they usually care about your vulnerability. So keep that in mind. And then even this notion that we have to love our partner, all of us have to love our partner all the time. The truth is we don't, and we can still have a wonderful relationship. And that's another reason, going back to your question, Kashana, of why voice dialogue is safe. It makes room for things that might be troublesome to really feel. And sometimes, there's such things as irreconcilable differences. I always like to say a couple meet, fall in love, get together, but one is inherently wanting rural situations to live in and one inherently wants urban. Ultimately, that's going to be a problem. So again, with these inner selves, you can weigh how much of a loss is it for you personally if you're the one that wants the rural, but you give up, or for those cells' point of view, living in the country as much as you would like. Maybe what you thought was irreconcilable and you had to break up, you realize, wow, well, if we get a country place and I'm there 4 days a week and you come on weekends, that there are solutions. And that's the other reason this is so great. That black and white thinking, it just melts it. And the other thing it does, it sometimes shows you that, yeah, I've got to make a difficult decision. I have to feel my feelings. Something has to end and I'm going to grieve it, but I can handle it because I have access now to my superpower of tolerating my vulnerability and even wanting it. And Kashana has written, when couples work with the selves, it also reflects the unique relationship wisdom that deepens the bond. Yep. Because the other thing is often couples hold the hidden self of the other. So often an extrovert gets together with an introvert and they love each other at first because it's like they hold the golden shadows of each other. So an extrovert would be very attracted to an introvert because that extrovert needs some of that introversion. And the introversion would just feel so protected. And it's like, oh, that extrovert's going to take care of my social life and we can just be together and it's going to be wonderful. And it will for a while. But then eventually the extrovert gets mad at the introvert and vice versa. So, so the other thing is often you end up not having to have your partner carry those parts in you. You can say, wow, all right, let me cultivate my own extrovert, because I actually should have a little extroversion, and vice versa. And how do I do that? Well, if someone's naturally leading with introverted selves, then they can do fun experiments to an extrovert, which is like go out or say yes to an invitation. Or an introvert may say, well, let me spend an hour a day journaling and really see how it feels to be by myself with myself. And so Normeen is asking, so before making an important decision, one should be in a particular self, is the question. Like, should one be in a particular self? I would say no, not necessarily a particular self. So when the way we work it is that here I am in center, I'm my whole self because I have access to the different parts of me. So when you're making an important decision, first you write down in like the tug of war, the decision that should be made. Do I do X or do I do Y? And you then go to different parts of yourself. If you have very vulnerable part, that's part of the equation. A really great exercise is to journal from your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, journaling from your left hand as an inner child can be very moving and open things up for you. But then once you do the exploration, then you would do it from the center so that you get the information from the different parts. And then here you make a conscious decision, so that it's more from your more fully aware self, not one self. And so I'm touching on primary selves right now, which Nermeen has asked, and that's really important. So the primary selves, as I mentioned earlier, are the selves we lead with. Often it's the self that when you say, oh, I'm me, I'm Bridgit, and this is just who I am. That could represent different primary selves. So for me, that could be selves I lead with. I'm an extrovert. I have an introvert side too, but I'm a leader. I love people. I'm responsible. So these primary selves, which are also called inner selves, subpersonalities, alter egos, it's who you lead with, who you're most comfortable with. And if you're not sure, you can ask your friends, like to use adjectives, like how would you describe me? Give me 4 or 5 adjectives. And someone would say, oh, you love football. Now, you could be an athlete or you could be a spectator. So depending on how you love football, your primary self might actually be a spectator and your more hidden self would be your athlete, or vice versa. So those adjectives can often represent selves: the life of the party, the class clown, the serious one, the get it done one. Yes, please, people, if you would, leave some of yourselves in the chat room. I want to see what selves are here. I love summer self, Kashana just put into the chat. And that's the primary selves, the selves that you lead with. And often one is stuck because what's being required is for you to start strengthening selves you're not used to leading with. Oh, I want to host a dinner party self. Oh, yes. Alicia has a yoga self. My yoga self is bonding with yours. I too love yoga. Oh, and thanks, Ruben. I appreciate you thanking me for the presentation. Traveling the world self. That's from Catherine. And thank you, Fabian, for saying that you enjoyed the presentation. Mexican self, Canadian self. I didn't touch on this, but yes, we have cultural selves. And we also have selves that may speak an early language that we learned. Oh, Kashana has a fix-it self. So the other thing, again, going back to the safety, is voice dialogue assumes that we have selves that are culturally defined as well as like familially in our own individual family defined, and also the expectations that go with those selves. If you start to realize that you're kind of trapped by expectations that intellectually you don't necessarily support, but you have one of your early selves that were attached to maybe a grandparent and that grandparent's culture, you start to be aware, wow, I didn't realize how much I followed these traditional protocols. And now that you know that, you can make a conscious decision. And voice dialogue would never say, well, throw it away or keep it. That's going to be up to you. A clear self. Yeah, a clear self. I think probably my wanting clarity self was one of my selves that helped me find voice dialogue all those years ago. Oh, Fabian said a reading self, a disciplined self. Yeah, these are wonderful selves. And also, they all have their own unique intelligences. And so when you can realize that a disciplined self is amazing, but again, if you're so disciplined and that part of you takes over your life and is primary, then you're not probably going to be spontaneous or relaxed in a way that's very important for relationships and for overall health. So I think we're starting to wrap it up. So yes, the other thing about all these wonderful selves I'm looking at in the chat box is that you don't want to throw any away. They might go to the forefront or the background, and this gives you more power to do that. And thank you, everyone. It's such an amazing time being here with you. I look forward to staying in touch. I put some information Kashana has through in the chat box. The Final Eighth book is available everywhere. And I just hope you take what you learned and have fun with this. This really is an invitation to enjoy an adventure. And if a part is difficult, AKA makes you feel in ways that are a bit painful, that's okay. It's getting in touch with you because it wants your attention. It has a message. And if you stop, you can even say, hey, tearful one, why so many tears now? And then let that tearful one say, well, this is what's going on. And often that's just listening to that part of you is enough. And Catherine can't wait to try this out. It's really fun. Yeah. Yeah. And you can role play as different selves. But remember, when selves speak, it's not role play in the sense that it's somehow rehearsed. But maybe we'll just end different roles. Let's just say a lawyer. A lawyer could bring different selves to their job. So if they're in the middle of the courtroom, they need to bring different parts of themselves, which is different than when they're negotiating with other lawyers how to make a deal. And so even within particular roles, like a professional role, you can bring different aspects to yourself. And certainly it's fun to try out, bringing in your prude versus your wild one. There's lots of ways you can have fun with this. But if you find yourself judging a part of yourself, just go to that part and say, tell me about yourself. So it's time to say goodbye and thank you. And it's been a real pleasure.